Thank you for doing this. For a start, why did you write The Dark Side of Technology?
I think I have a message to get across, which is that technology is fantastic, it's marvelous. Without it, the world will be a different place. But we're so excited about the technology that we rarely sit back and think, are there any side problems that we should look at or address? And I realize there are many across the whole range of technologies, from medicine to chemistry to physics, electronics. And in some of them, they are so serious that they could actually destroy us. So I'm trying to write a book to an audience who is not normally a scientific audience, but an audience who may have the clout, the charisma and the drive to try and do something to help protect us in the future.
So a lot of scientists today are writing about this issue of existential risk, and your book focuses on the technological side of things. What threat, or which of these threats, is the most serious in your opinion?
Okay, there's a range of threats. There's a technology which can be damaged by natural events, and they're bound to happen. There's the threats to us which are totally outside our control, like a meteor impact. And there are threats which are insidious but getting worse. And in that category, I would definitely put in all the types of cybercrime and the potential for cyber warfare, because those are so obvious and so easy to implement. And if they were implemented seriously, it could wipe out entire nations.
One of the things I thought very interesting in your book, and I suppose I thought about sunspot activity before, but you bring out a sort of a mega example of that and the effect that would have. Can you tell me what exactly it does?
In fact, it's not a mega example, it's just a fairly big example. Back in 1859, there was a big sunspot eruption which hit us, and so beautiful aurora, which were extended and even seen down as far south as Cuba. And the only electronics around at that time was the telegraph system across the US. But the electrical activity that generated from the sunspots, particles hitting the poles and making magnetic fields, actually destroyed, caused fires, and shocked the operators. And that was a very low-level type of electronics. The electronics that we have now, if we had an equivalent sunspot activity, which is not that rare, it could potentially take out all the electrical grid systems, because the antenna which pick up the signals are the electrical cables of the grid. So you've now got 4,000-mile long links which would generate enormous signals. Even if you only destroy the power units, you'd be out of power for a very long time. I have seen studies written which say that if you only counted the sunspot damage as far south as New York, then it would be between 30 days and 3 years before the power was fully restored. That doesn't sound that desperate, but in fact, if you take out all electrical power, you can imagine the disaster that would cause.
And it has, because it wreaks havoc on our communication system.
Oh, it'd be millions dead. And sunspots activity fluctuates. And statistically, one would expect something the size of the 1859 event about every 100 years or so. So on that basis, we're
overdue.
We're a little bit overdue, but since then, there have been other things which have taken out power stations in New York, in Canada, and in Sweden. Some of those within this century, but nothing on the scale of the Carrington event in terms of total energy coming in. If we had an equivalent one, the antenna which would pick up the signals could be, for example, the entire electrical grid system, and that would take out power units across everywhere, and there are not replacements sitting there to be put back in. So we would be completely electrically powerless for months. So if you have such an event, say in Canada or North America in the winter, no electrical power, no food, no water, nothing. The other thing which at a more minor level is that the signals generated by the sunspot activity can interfere with communications to aeroplanes. In 2014, there was a patch of the Pacific which was completely dead because of a sunspot. And fortunately, the planes flying there just kept going. But if they happened to have appeared over Europe, say on a rainy, foggy day, there's something like 30,000 European flights going at any one time. There's 10,000 cross-Atlantic flights. There's another 30,000, 100,000 total flights in America. If you killed communication to those pilots, you've got a very nasty problem. And this is something which is almost impossible to overcome. Secondly, it's likely to destroy many of the satellites, which again, if we lose satellite communication, the current world is in deep, deep trouble.
Well, it's paradoxical, is it not, that the sun, which we look as
Life.
source of life, presents us with a major threat. And one of the things you talked about in your book is this human ability to foresee in order to overcome problems. Has something happened to our ability to foresee?
I don't think that's anything different from the past. Some people sit down and think and look ahead, but they are a real minority. And if you've got a really exciting developments which are moving very rapidly, like electronics, computer links, cell phones and all these things, people just don't have time to look far enough forward. And if the people do look forward, they're always dismissed as being, oh, you're being pessimistic. And that, I think, is a deep, deep problem.
Now, one important aspect of modern technological development then is the parallel loss of data, something that you write quite a bit about. You say this: the faster we make technological advances, the shorter the survival time of records and information. Why is this a problem as long as we're making progress?
It's fairly clear that the statement that information is surviving for a shorter time because of better technology is happening, because you carved I lived here on a block of stone. It takes you ages to do it. The stone will sit there for 5,000 years. You take a picture of the people here, you send it to your friends on your phone, they look at it once and it's dead 1 second later. So the more information, faster transmission, but survival of it is much, much less. But people's culture, the whole of their history, depends on having records. So if you, for example, stored all your family photos on your computer, you may have Victorian pictures of your ancestors, and they look faded, but they're certainly ancestors, and you know where you've come from. You do it on a modern system, within 10 years you find that the technology of the recording has changed, your pictures are obsolete, and the chances that your grandchildren will ever even be able to read them is completely gone. And if you're a historian, you can't write about what happened here and there because the information just won't exist. There were many suggestions from companies saying, we have this magnificent cloud store, you don't need anything, we keep everything on the cloud store. The fact is that it started off being free, it no longer is free. And in principle, okay, take an extreme case. You die, your bank cancels your subscription to the cloud store, it's wiped. It may have everything that you wanted to preserve on that system.
So the aspect of data loss can be very significant. If we're talking about personal photographs, that's one thing. But if you're talking about a whole technology, all the records of a particular technology, you're in a very different position with that.
Yes, that's right. It's not just technology. I mean, so for example, if you own buildings and you have a land registry and they move it all onto a computer system, the computer system has either a collapse or some covert software which destroys it. You've then got no records of ownership. And you can't redress that. You can't get it back again. If you're a historian, you want to see who had contacts with whom, who was having correspondence. If it's electronic email, the future historians got a dreadful problem because they won't be able to find any of this stuff. Even if they find it, it may be in a format which they can't read. I've got software at home, I've got a stack of disks of past correspondence. I can't read them. The software has changed, the disk format has changed. I might just as well have never kept them.
So in analysing the downsides of various technologies, the problem seems to be, anyway, that short-term gains are often what we're concentrating on, and that's outweighing consideration of long-term dangers. How do you see that problem being resolved?
I don't. That's human nature. If you're marketing mobile phones or cell phones, few, you make brilliant things. The life expectancy before people buy a new one is maybe 18 months. That's $1,000 in 18 months. It's a huge business, very profitable. You market it so that you throw away the old ones and deliberately make the old ones obsolete in some ways so that people don't want them. So you are pressuring people into moving to new technology. And that is, okay, that was an extreme case, but it really happens across the whole system.
So Francis Bacon writes New Atlantis. He envisages a wonderful scientific utopia. Today we're living in the Anthropocene, and we say it's a negative consequence of scientific endeavor, I suppose, or technology. What might he make of it if he were here today?
Well, it depends on his viewpoint. He could say, look, we've now got a population which has expanded to 7.5 billion. From his vintage, there was absolutely no way that that sort of population could have been fed and housed and cared for in any way. It was way beyond the capability. We are coping with that. And in reality, if we were not so wasteful of the way we produce, distribute, and store food, we could probably cope with almost 3 times that number. So that is real progress. But you don't get progress without downsides, and the downsides are other aspects that Bacon, for example, would never have been able to think about.
Can we talk a little bit about global warming? I think this is where you were making the point that there's a lot of personal opinion here, but I would like to get your thoughts on what it is we need to be aware of in assessing claims that global warming is a reality.
Okay, fine. You've got a nice contentious question, which from an American's viewpoint tends to be different from everybody else. So let me start by saying the Earth's heat cycles have varied between ice ages and hot temperatures, and it's perfectly reasonable that we may be heading back into a warm period. That's not anything contentious at all, because that's just long history of those things happening. I think for me, what I need to say is, do I personally believe in global warming from things that are within my own experience? Because if I don't believe that, then I'm definitely not going to believe what somebody writes about. So let me give you a couple of examples. I have a friend who's a geologist who works in Greenland. When he started his work, he's studying some cliff face. He said he used to have to cross an ice field to get to it. 20 years later, he now walks across a beach. The ice is gone. The Austrian ski resorts, since I think the year 2000, have got a ski season which is 35 days shorter because there's no snow. Now they're addressing it, they're making snow machines and frantically making artificial snow, but the reality is it's got warmer. My friends who are good gardeners say, yep, there's no question spring in the UK is coming a month earlier than previously, and in the records of temperature in the UK, which are pretty good, pretty accurate, and have been for a long time, say that the hottest summers, hottest peaks and so forth, I think the top 10 have been in the last 20 years. So all that evidence to me is confirming that at least in the UK, I've got no problem about saying things are getting warmer. for an American, you've got a problem. You've got a very big country with immensely different ranges of temperature naturally. 80% of you live in cities, so you're air-conditioned or heating, you go out in heated cars, and you're not going to be sensitive to small changes. And at the moment, it is a small change that you're going to be seeing, because roughly 3% of any excess energy which is generated from any source goes into the air. The rest of it goes into the oceans and into the earth. So we are only sensitive to this very tiny bit. So for me, I've got no problem. There is global warming. The difficulty is saying how much of it is coming from nature, how much of it is coming from us. There's no question that we're contributing, because the production of CO2 from all the stuff that we burnt is enormous. So yes, there is global warming. If we've got some influence on it, fine, then we should try and do something, because otherwise it's going to run away from us.
Why are we so reluctant, you think, to deal with this problem of greenhouse gases?
Half of that I've just answered, because I think, again, from a country where you personally don't experience it, you're going to think it doesn't exist. Certainly, if you were running a business, if I were running a business which involved a lot of power production, and I couldn't see any short-term profit, I would be loath to say, oh yes, I've got to do something and cut back the way I function, because I possibly wouldn't have the long-term view. It is possible to try and generate power successfully without burning coal. I think Denmark has something like 90% of its power from wind farms. A month ago in this country, they were saying that all power in the country of one day had come from not renewable sources, not from others. So it's a step in the right direction. And the other thing, which again is encouraging to try and do that, is that no matter what you think, if you go to any city with lots of traffic, the pollution levels are dreadful. I go to London sometimes, I've been to Beijing, and walking in Beijing, within half an hour you've got a sore throat, and it's just from the traffic fumes.
You say you're optimistic by nature and convinced by instinct, not evidence, that humanity will survive. But you also mention that what we are by nature, and here you say the human characteristic features of aggression, power-seeking, and personal gain, and you conclude from that part of humanity is unlikely to change. Those two things sound to me like a contradiction.
Well, the aggression, the desire for power, the desire for land, if you're religious, you're going to say you've got the 7 deadly sins. But those are the very things which have actually moved us from the Stone Age into technology and society as we know it today. Because we want more, we've put the effort in to do it. Much of technology is developed because of warfare. I mean, people didn't make bronze cooking pans, they made bronze swords because they wanted to use the swords. And this is a standard pattern. So there is 1.5 of us which is driving because we are humans and we want more. And the other half is thinking more rationally and saying, is this good? And you've always got this conflict. We've survived this far. That's why I'm optimistic that we might survive further.
You mentioned Martin Rees's book, The Last Century. In the US, it came out as The Last Hour. I don't know whether you know that or not. A great marketing idea that I think, it's more urgent if it's the last hour than if it's the last century.
Well, the last hour is a little bit close.
But and yet, you've said to me a little while ago that you'd be surprised if we survive, or perhaps the threat will really come to a focus within a decade or thereabouts. And we're talking about the last century, and a lot of these existential risks writers will frame it in terms of a century or 2050, but your time scale is a little shorter. Why is that?
Okay, maybe I'm not being quite careful enough. I'm saying that civilization as we know it at the moment could be destroyed, collapse, or be run down. I think as a survival of people who would then continue, but not with the civilization that we have, that's quite feasible. I mean, if you take the 1918, in Europe, there had been a war, 20 million people killed in the war. Immediately after the war, there was the thing called the Spanish flu that is estimated to have killed between 40 and 50 million. So that, as a percentage of Europe, was enormous. The Black Death back in 1400 and something, that also killed about a third of Europeans. So there was a total collapse in both cases for a long time, but it wasn't a situation where there were no humans left and recovery took place. So if we have some people who survive, those people will effectively inherit what is left of the earth and they will redevelop. Whether they learn from the past, who knows?
So Einstein is famous for saying, probably in a New York Times article, I think, around about 1946, that it's easier to denature plutonium than it is to denature the evil spirit of man, he said.
Well said.
So you'd agree with that?
Well, he played the violin, and I played the violin, therefore I obviously agree with him.
Almost everything we see around us is a product of applied science, fibers and wood and materials and medicine. What in this room is actually natural? There are a few things, but
Well,
there's some wood.
There's some wood here. Yes.
Few things. But the driver of technology is economics. Would changes to our economic systems, the way we understand the economic order, drive technology in a more helpful rather than a more harmful direction?
I think it would be feasible to try and use the technology with less waste. And if you could do that, then you would not be trying to exploit as much of the world as rapidly. If one could actually persuade people not to expand the populations at an enormous rate, that would help. But this is contrary to people who are marketing goods because they want more people to buy their goods. So there was a conflict in there. But in terms of food, I've seen many studies which claim that from what the farmers grow to what actually is got to the supermarket, through the supermarket, to the people is cooked and not thrown away at the end, the actual amount used can be as low as 30% of the food that they've grown. And this is extremely wasteful and is a culture, and it could be changed. You don't need to overeat and throw away food like that. So that would take the pressure off many parts of the world.
Now in Europe, you have a different approach. I mean, I think about, you mentioned Denmark here a little while ago. Germany, I think I read recently, is about 85% self-sustaining with renewables energy. In the US, we don't have that a view of things so evident. How would you account for the difference between the European view of things like conservation or recycling, or reuse, with this other model that we are driven by in the US, which is very much consumer-oriented? It's very much quarterly, bottom line, profits. What is the difference between these two perspectives?
Many reasons. One is the fairly obvious one, is that if you look at the land mass and the area of the main part of the United States and the population, you've got a very tiny population for that sort of land mass. compared with Europe. I mean, the States, I think, is no more than Germany and France put together, maybe, and England as well, together in terms of population. But in land area, it's 20 times bigger, maybe. So you don't feel you have to conserve. You can just go out and move to somewhere else. So once you realize there's some pressure on you, then I think your view will start to change.
There are, of course, American writers, I think of a man like Wendell Berry, who very much would relate to what's being done in Europe when it comes to in fact, he would go further. He would say, I feel guilty using a chainsaw. You know, he's very much on the other side of it. A brilliant thinker, a man who spent all of his life talking about respect for land, respect for resources. There are people like that, but that is a perspective that's very hard to find. It's hard to find just about anywhere. I think it requires a certain kind of sensitivity to what it is we have here. You know, his big thing would be, and if he did it biblically, he'd say this. He'd say, the original statement is, here's the land, dress and keep it. There's your basic, original first statement, if you like, of care and nurture of land. Preserve and conserve and have a respectful view of the place you're living.
Yeah, well, I mean, that doesn't go along with the development of the US, because the so-called Pilgrim Fathers who went there thought that England was not strict enough for them. They went there, they landed on a new land and promptly killed the natives and took their land from them. So this is not preserving, this is actually invasion. People don't choose to phrase it that way, but that's the reality.
Right. So consumerism is a driver of bad technology?
It contributes, yes, it must do.
You're right that there's political and industrial opposition to directing our technology in better directions. Can this be overcome?
My guess is that it will only be overcome when you have enough education and understanding by the politicians and the people running the companies and the countries to realize that it's not ideal in the long term just to look for the short-term profit. I mean, almost inevitably, politicians are going to be fairly mature people and possibly not thinking 20 years ahead, because they probably don't think they're going to be around in 20 years ahead. If you have a president who's 70, you're not necessarily thinking he's going to be president in 20 years' time.
You say pointing out some of the scenarios of the end of our species might help us move in a better direction. How would, I'm going to call it technological repentance, choosing life over death, be achieved? How would that happen?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by life over death in this case.
Well, making a choice to do that which is conserving of human life, or making a choice to continue going down a road that is technologically challenged, is producing bad effects.
I think that's come back to the same answer. You've just got to have the people who actually have the charisma and the drive to make things happen, for them to be saying, this is the direction we've got to take. And then the rest will follow, because we're sheep. We follow the others.
Right. Sometimes asking a question a different way allows you to, reformulate it, rephrase it. So sometimes these questions are a replication, if you like, but it sometimes, from an editing point of view, it's a good way to get you to say it slightly.
I mean, also your questions like this are questions that I've faced up to and been trying to face up to ever since I started writing this book, because
Right.
they were at a subliminal level before.
Yes.
But the act of writing, and you think, but this is obvious that we're in deep trouble here. Mm-hmm. Why is nobody trying to mention it?
Right.
And I've done a book with quite a few chapters in different aspects of life, technology, and society.
Yes.
And what think I see is a common thread across all of these areas. Most people have tended to only write books about one aspect. I mean, there's the brilliant book by Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring,
Yes.
50 years ago,
Yes.
where she concentrated on herbicides, pesticides, and their downsides. And it was very effective, and up to that point, people just didn't care, didn't even think about it. But I don't think many people have realized that it's the same pattern being repeated over and over again.
When does geoengineering go from good? I mean, you think about dams and hydroelectricity, irrigation, good thing, to bad, silting up, salinization. How do we avoid it? Where's the switch between the two?
The switch, I think, in these sorts of situations come when you have a major dam which collapses. There's been a dam in the States which has just recently had the water level dropped because it was creaking. You've got the things like the huge Yangtze River power station, which is immense and a huge amount of power, which going out into China and being of real value to the economy. But China also has quite major earthquakes. One hopes that the dam designers have got it strong enough to cope with the earthquakes, because if not, A, they'll lose their power, and B, they'll lose an enormous amount of land and people if the dam did collapse. But this has always been the case with dams. Even the Hoover Dam has had problems occasionally. So, yeah, dam design is sensitive to natural forces which we can do nothing about. And I mean, I picked China as an example there because there's been at least one earthquake in China which killed more than 1 million people. So it's a land which can suffer from earthquakes.
And the size of the dam and the pressure, downward
yeah,
pressure.
the pressure and the location.
Right. What would you say then is the right balance between, or in the precautionary principle?
To be sure that when you're building some major structure, you have tried to think beyond how cheaply can I build it and get it up and running, and think, will it not just be up and running for the next 10 years, but could it be up and running for the next 100? Because if you're going for something on that sort of engineering scale, that's the minimum of what you've got to do. I mean, if you look at the big suspension bridges, some of them been up now of a period when the cables of the suspension bridge are known to be cracking up. If you put microphones on the end of the cables, you can actually hear a ping every so often when one of the little cables snaps. But the vehicles are getting heavier, you've got the traffic load is heavier, and so that at some point, even the big suspension bridges are often going to be thought to be no longer viable. And that's a great investment to try and make a new one.
To resolve then some of the existential risks we face, there has to be some kind of an interface between the kind of commentary you're making here and the creation of policy. When I've talked to others about this, that's where it all seems to break down. What kind of a body would you foresee bridging this gap?
I don't think that having a single body is going to do it, because there are too many problems and conflicts involved. I think you've got to maybe have a body which addresses one type of problem and at least try and resolve that, even if you have a parallel activity. Because the way I see the way the world runs is the bigger the setup that you make in terms of an over-bridging body, the more it becomes politically attractive, the more it becomes a great thing to be the director of. And then you become egocentric about it and you don't really have any personal hold on what's happening. That's why I think you've got to keep the the repair activities under the control of people who focus on one thing, because then they may do it. If they become over-bridging, then it's very, very difficult.
You've hinted along the way here that leadership is necessary, informed leadership, perhaps even moral, ethical leadership when it comes to what is good and bad about a situation. But it seems to me, unless you have an overarching, a sort of a United Nations kind of an approach to existential threat, that we're always going to be limited by the economics that underlie a lot of what we do, by some of these aspects of human nature that you've alluded to, aggression and desire for power and so forth. After the Second World War, Douglas MacArthur made a statement, something to the effect that the nature of war was now so potentially catastrophic, and of course he's coming at it after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki situations. And he says the only thing that can get us beyond where we are now is what he calls a recrudescence of the human spirit. As if there has to be a higher level, an appeal to a higher set of principles than the kinds of things that govern most of what we deal with on an everyday basis. But what would you say about that kind of an argument?
The sentiment, absolutely right. The reality, it just doesn't go along with the way we happen. People don't feel the pressure and the need to take action. I mean, I've read of people who deal with major disaster scenarios, and they say that if you have a big threat of a tsunami, for example, coming into some region, typically half the people will say it's never going to happen to us. So even though the evidence is there, you've got the warning, the people won't move and get out of the way. And I think this is the same inertia in all these sorts of improvements in the way we run our lives.
And you see, this to me, I mean, in talking, I've spoken to several informed people like yourself who are trying very hard to bring this to public attention, to get some kind of a groundswell, some kind of bottom-up approach to resolving these things. Put it before your politicians, tell them what it is you're concerned about. Maybe that's how it will change. But we always seem to founder in the end when we think about what we are, the problem of human nature. It keeps coming back on us, you know. I mean, I applaud what you've written in your book. I think it's a wonderful book. It's so detailed. It's full of practical information. You're optimistic by nature, but do you feel you're going to be ultimately disappointed?
Probably, but if I don't try, if other people don't try, if I don't encourage other people to try, then I would feel I've failed. So I'm driven in the sense that I want to try and see change. I want people to recognize that change is feasible. If I go back to the case of Rachel Carson, you know, because that's just over 50 years ago, her statements were ridiculed and all her work was denigrated, and it was only because the companies making the chemicals were so critical of her that there was a committee set up by the US government that looked into the matter and then realized that she was telling the truth. 50 years later, many of those problems are still there, different chemicals. And it hasn't succeeded because it probably never will, but it has improved. And I think I would feel success if my writings at least got improvement. I know that it's never going to be a complete solution.
Let me see, we've pretty well covered everything. Is there anything you want to say?
Yes, I think I'm looking at disaster scenarios. And at the time of writing my book, I've mentioned a few natural ones, some which, like the sunspot ones, which we've got no control over, but which could be pretty bad if they happen. And I talked about cybercrime, because that is a huge booming industry, and getting bigger and bigger. But there was an event very recently in England of a computer attack on the National Health Service using software written by America for warfare activity. And it was a very minor attack with what was feasible. It infected the National Health Service, which is local area networks which are connected, so there's something like 51,000 total sites. So it spread very rapidly. It also spread very rapidly all over the rest of the world. But it was killed, and although it looked as though it was somebody trying to make money to reinstate your computer, it clearly wasn't that. I'm extremely concerned, because it was one software written with warfare in mind. It's the sort of thing which can be done just as easily by a big nation like America or Russia. Certainly Israel is very good at this stuff. North Korea has several thousand people working in this very topic. You only have to have software which is so infectious, you could not just interfere with people's computers, you could wipe everything. And when I say wipe everything, I mean that all control systems. And it would be easy to implement, and then absolute chaos. So this, for me, is the sort of concern. When I was writing the chapter on cybercrime, I sat down and I thought about all sorts of possible cybercrimes. Two of them I thought, these are really bad, I won't put them in. By the time I'd finished writing, both of them had happened. I have another list of things which haven't yet happened, but if I have a reprint, maybe I'll be able to include some of those. And because it's so simple to make cybercrime, cyber warfare, I see this as a really serious threat.
You mentioned the Oroville Dam. We live quite close to it.
Oh, yes.
So we watched that whole episode, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I see things like that, an earthquake which destroys maybe your dam or the Yangtze Dam or one of the others, in hard numbers, hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million people would be killed.
Yes.
Dreadful, sure, but it's not going to end the society and civilization that we have at the moment.
No.
So I see these in two distinct sort of categories. Okay?
Right.
The 2004 tsunami killed about 250,000 people. Mm-hmm. Again, dreadful if you're involved in it, but it hasn't destroyed the world.
And then the whole issue of biological.
I mean, in the case of satellites, there's 1,500 working satellites at the moment. I've seen that there's another 8,000 planned to go up to have higher definition TV, third-rate channels and all the rest of it. There are 100,000 fragments tracked by NASA from broken up satellites, which fall apart about 1 or 2 per year, and they have to move the space station so that they don't get hit with them. But I worked out that if you have something like a cell phone fragment traveling at orbital speed, the kinetic energy on impact is roughly 500 times greater than a modern tank shell. So you think nothing, but when you look at the speed they're traveling at, an impact is going to then cause far more fragments, And this effectively it could lead to a runaway destruction of the satellites up there. If you take out satellites, in terms of communication, banking, everything, really big problem. And that is likely to happen over the next 20, 30 years, unless we could find some way of removing fragments from that zone of space where they have to sit.
Lack of foresight.
No, and this isn't foresight here, because people understand it. People have recognized the problem, but we have no idea how to address it. We don't know how to clean it up.
Good. I thank you.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure talking to you.
I appreciate your time.
Fine. Thank you.